Hey everyone. So this week I have an opportunity to do a little bit of an in-depth look at the Office of Special Affairs as an intelligence operation. The reputation of the Church of Scientology for its litigation and use of dirty tricks, or fair gaming as it's called, is infamous. The Church of Scientology is well known for this. And amongst members and former members, there is an idea that the Office of Special Affairs, which is a division of the Church of Scientology International, is a well-oiled, glittering machine of efficiency when it comes to doing covert operations and intelligence work against former members and critics of the church. And we've talked about this a lot on this channel and in other places. But turns out that some of this reputation might not be so well deserved, and in fact might come out of a straight up ignorance of what an actual well-oiled, glittering model of efficiency really looks like when it comes to counterintelligence and intelligence and covert operations. So what we're doing this week is I have a guest here, Jeff Wasel, and he is somebody who has never been involved in the Church of Scientology, but became interested in it. So welcome, Jeff, to my channel and to this video. Thank you for being part of this.
Chris, it's a pleasure. Thank you, sir.
Absolutely. So first off, what was it that, well, first off, I guess, let's talk about your background and credentials in talking about this subject. What is it that you bring to this?
So there's a couple things. What got me looking at the church was I was a doctoral candidate in information systems security at the London School of Economics, tasked with looking at the early auspices of Patriot, the Patriot Act, behavioral profiling, a lot of the things that came to the fore after 9/11, as we all know that, kind of the rise of the security state and things like that. And one of the things that was missing was a detailed understanding of how this applied to transnational criminal organizations and the way they move money laundering, hawala banking, which is the traditional way that terrorists like the Taliban use, and other things like that.
Right.
And interestingly, when I was poking around in the stacks and in the database, I came across a couple articles that referenced L. Ron Hubbard and his behavior on the Apollo in Interpol records. I'm sure many of you that are church historians know that he carried around large sums of cash on the Apollo and used it as a means to, or as a vehicle to get the establishment of offshore entities in Monaco, Liechtenstein, and the Bahamas. So what got me interested in the whole subject matter, though, when I went back to grad school was I have a background in intelligence in the Marine Corps. I'm a graduate of the Navy Marine Corps Intelligence School at Dam Neck, Virginia, and prior to that, I was in the infantry and reconnaissance field. So I've been kind of both an asset and an analyst, if you will, a collection asset. And the thing that kept coming back to me in looking at Scientology, even before I got aware of, the whole thing with yourself, Tony Ortega, the whole milieu of critics, if you will, was this undertone of kind of malice and in kind of covert activity that I saw that was kind of popping out at me from these Interpol files. So fast forward, I'm finishing up my degree and I see the Tom Cruise video. I also become aware of Alexander Jentzsch's story, which kind of tipped it for me. And that's when I reached out to Karen and Jeff down there in LA and said, what can I do? I'm a money guy. I have a background in financial crime. It looks like these guys are dirty 6 ways to Sunday. So that's when I went down the rabbit hole. And the more I got into it, the more I said, well, all I'm seeing is yet another manifestation of a transnational criminal organization operating under the guise of a church. And so I figured it was a way that I could use my chops to perhaps take a look at this and right some of the wrongs I see, particularly the abuse of the tax exempt situation, for instance. I think there's something fundamental wrong with, using donations that are given in good faith to, clandestinely spy and harass people.
Big time.
And
Big
so,
time.
and that kind of grated not only on my sense of just morality, but also it's an affront to people that are dedicated intelligence professionals or law enforcement officers or what have you. And also the whole stolen valor thing with Hubbard and the Navy. As a former Marine, that really grates on me too. So it was kind of a perfect storm of outrage, if you will. And lately, it seems because of what's been going on aftermath, if you will, there's been a heightened focus again on the antics of the church relative to smearing and these kind of what I would call psychological operations against critics. And I mean, this stuff goes back yonks, as you know, but I think now with the rise of the internet, there's more of us that are never ins, if you will, or, have no real skin in the game, but just find this just abhorrent. And so, again, looking at this intelligence myth, I figured, I'm going to throw that like the old Apple commercial where the guy throws a hammer at the IBM thing. I'm here to throw the hammer at this understanding of the church being this omnipotent intelligence organization.
Right. Excellent.
So as far as my chops, I have a PhD from the London School of Economics. I've done several masters there. I've worked with all kinds of intelligence. I mean, this is my stuff. This is the world I live in, primarily looking at crime from a financial standpoint. So it lends itself to my scrutiny in a way I think is somewhat rather unique.
Excellent. And for anybody, you've obviously hooked up with Karen and Jeffrey Augustine, who's been on my podcast and has his own YouTube channel, Surviving Scientology, and of course the Scientology Money Project. And you also have been working with a man who identifies himself as John P. Capitalist.
Yeah, we're fellow travelers in our regard for, I think, scientific rigor and numbers. JP was kind enough to ask me to blog again, and that's where you found the piece I did on the church and intelligence. But we've been collaborating a lot with Jeff behind the scenes on a kind of, Jeff has a phenomenal institutional understanding of the church and has been mapping kind of the contracts and all this other stuff. I think it came to the fore there on Aftermath when he was on there with Matt Pesh and Mike and the rest of the folks. But there's a lot of other stuff that's going on under the hood that we're trying to money map the way the church behaves, not only domestically, but transnationally, because it still has a presence in, I mean, pretty much anywhere where money moves, where there's access to people that have money to give. I mean, this thing's a money machine. So at the end of the day, the best way to bring it down is follow the money. And that's what we're trying to do. And again, JP and I, our skill set is looking at it in a window of financial crime, his Wall Street chops, and looking at, what are the cash, what's the motivation for getting money? How does money get acquired? It's basically the whole buy proposition, if you will, about the church.
Excellent. And I am expecting that there will be some interesting work coming out on all of that.
Absolutely.
Your recent blog post with John P. JP highlighted specifically the Office of Special Affairs and the intelligence, which is the intelligence arm of the Church of Scientology. The Office of Special Affairs, for anybody who doesn't know, is a division of the Church of Scientology International. It's manned exclusively by Sea Org members, and at the international level, at least, right? At the local level, at a local church level, like Denver, New York, Milano, you have staff members who are working for OSA, but at the next level up, it is all Sea Org members. And their job, the three things that OSA is tasked with are legal. Anything having to do with legal affairs for the Church of Scientology, automatically you're dealing with OSA. Public relations, anything having to do with broad public relations, international public relations, church spokesmen, that sort of thing, that's all OSA. And investigations. And that's the dirty tricks part of the church.
I would also submit, Chris, too, if we're looking at budget buckets, that public relations is nothing more than propaganda, which again is an arm, is the way to look at this organization in terms of what its actual remit is.
Yes.
And if there's something I can interject here that's kind of one of my grails, is that I think it's incumbent of the critic movement to change the narrative of the church on how we look at the church. And instead of describing it in its own terms, use terms that are indicative of the actual behavior from a criminality standpoint. For instance, if you look at disconnection, as far as I'm concerned, it's just another means of extortion. You're putting pressure on somebody to incent a particular type of behavior that's beneficial to an organization. Last time I looked, twisting somebody's arms against the law. And of course, the usurious amounts of money, I mean, it just goes on and on. So when I hear PR, I hear propaganda. When I hear intelligence, I hear spying and reputational ruin.
Big time.
So
Big time.
I'd like to plant that thought in the audience that when we're talking about the church, let's change this narrative, because when you own the narrative of something, it allows you to take the conversation in the direction you want it to go. The church has owned this narrative for entirely too long. And so I think that's probably one of the main motivations I had in attacking this myth of intelligence, is that that's exactly what it is. It's a myth. It's been created over time, and it's gotten some, kind of an urban lore element to it, if you will.
Well, that is exactly the reason we are doing this video right now, is what you just said. So let's dive into this by first, let's look at, let's establish what is proper intelligence when we talk about, that kind of activity. Because you looked at it and you said, yeah, what these guys are doing is not intelligence, right? And
exactly.
and I was fascinated by that, because I've been prepping for, a series of videos actually in the future to deconstruct OSA and how Hubbard uses his policies and various books that have been written and various things that are out there to indoctrinate OSA staff that they are the best and the brightest and the most amazing and wonderful people, and that what they are doing is wholly and completely rationalized and justified by the mission of clearing the planet, saving the world. What we're doing is, and justifies the means kind of mentality. That was the slant I was going to go on. But then I read your article and I'm like, what is this intelligence? Tell me about this,
Well, to back up, what that is, it's you're inculcating zealotry.
Yeah.
Okay. Every organization wants to have a sense of purpose, even stepping back from intelligence organizations. So I think the thing we also have to frame this discussion is kind of like our discussion the other day on the data series. There are steps and means that Scientology frames everything in, and some of it's absolutely ludicrous. Some of it has some premise. Other stuff is just inconsequential.
Yeah.
But if I look at the way that OSA has structured things, they've actually done a fairly good job of creating this entity. But at the end of the day, the sum of something is only, or the whole of something is only good as the sum of its parts, and also what the end result of all this activity is. So to your question about what intelligence entails, everybody uses it. I mean, we have innate intelligence on, what's the best credit card to get based on interest rates. It's a data collection exercise at the end of the day. And what intelligence organizations are tasked with is collecting intelligence that furthers the goals of the organization, be it Microsoft looking at competitive intelligence on the Linux operating system, or Ford looking to see what the next release of GM is going to be. It translates to any endeavor in human activity, but we're looking specifically as it relates to human behavior. And intelligence gathering is a highly emotive human activity. So right off the bat, Scientology is entering at something of a loss, because it tends to remove a lot of the human element about the way they look at things. It's so structured that it eliminates initiative, for instance. So in looking at intelligence, we have to have the freedom to understand where the data came from, what kind of knowledge we want to impart on it, and more importantly, to look at it objectively in a way that supports our conclusion, but may not necessarily fit the desired end result. So, and this is very important when we look at it in terms of the context of Scientology, because everything is so rote. Everything is so based on a policy, or it's so, terminal driven, as you call the ideal scene, right? For instance, looking at Paulette Cooper, the ideal scene there was to destroy somebody that was writing things about Scientology. Mm-hmm. Or in Operation Snow White was to, run a caper where we can get all these government documents and somehow scrub them so, L. Ron Hubbard comes out as pure as Snow White. But again, where's the planning? Intelligence involves planning. It involves conscious decisions all along the way involving the end result. And again, I don't understand where reputational ruin was any kind of good benefit that came out of either of those operations. Because at the end of the day, it did nothing for Scientology except expose it as this sinister, paranoid organization. Now, mind you, we all have seen what happened in Iraq, or, intelligence failures happen, but often it's not the intelligence, it's the way people that are tasked with acting on it take that intelligence to the next level. So myself as an intelligence officer, I might be able to give, the commanding officer X amount of stuff. We know where the enemy is, this, that, and the other thing. But if we can't, somehow impart the national will to carry on, to move that, either that battle, that attack, what have you, forward, if it's something at that level, or even at the tactical level, then it's a failure. It's a failure not necessarily of intelligence, but of will based on intelligence. So there's always a chicken and egg thing here that involves intelligence. And again, this is one of the things that this screams at me about Scientology, is that it's always about the process, but never about the outcome, as far as looking at all the permutations of potential outcomes. And that is so key to intelligence gathering.
Okay, fair enough. Because, so are you saying then that, like, for example, destroying Paulette Cooper as a source of, N theta against the Church of Scientology, in other words, bad news, right? She writes this book, Scandal of Scientology, in 1970 or whenever that came out, early 70s. And the church looks at that and goes, oh, we must destroy the purveyor of this information because that is where our problem source is. And by doing so, we will no longer have this person purveying this bad information about us. You're saying that that's not a really good use of intelligence, or...
No, because at the end of the day, it's not part of an intelligence operation. Let's look at what intelligence entails. Intelligence is the gathering information to further an institutional organizational goal. Now, within the umbrella of, say, intelligence at the nation state level, say of the CIA, MI6 in Britain, Mossad, there are compartmental operations that certainly include black bag or, under the auspices of espionage, which is where this stuff falls under. And, this plays to Hubbard's sense of, the sci-fi writer in him, for lack of a better context. Because this is all cloak and dagger stuff. It's cool. It's got all this neat stuff and gadgets and everything, but it still has, incredibly important ramifications at the end of the day, especially in terms of blowback. And so you'll hear me use a term probably through this conversation called blowback. And that's what happens when you screw something like that up without thinking about the N theta results, if you will.
Right.
How does they know that, by doing something with getting her fingerprint and not destroying the document, right? Good tradecraft, that it ends up getting hoovered up in an FBI sting, or that somebody defects that's part of that. I mean, you have to think through all the outlier behavior that can happen in an operation. Now, mind you, it's almost impossible to do, but again, a good intelligence officer tries to predict this, especially, again, when you're dealing with human intelligence or an espionage, when it's all about human behavior. I mean, you can sometimes get a buy when it's a satellite or it's some other form of electronic or mechanical intelligence gathering. I mean, clouds get in front of the lens, or you can't get airtime. I mean, that's all somewhat explainable. But people are somewhat predictable in the way they respond in certain situations. And then if we go fast forward to the Guardian's office thing with the operations, or Snow White, that was just a disaster. I mean, it's just like Watergate was to the Nixon administration, a nickel and dime, black bag burglary that ended up, completely capitulating an entire administration. So again, where's the win in that,
Right.
And again, I come back thinking these through a process. Hubbard talks about a process, but they in no way resemble what I would call sound intelligence principles.
No, and I've never read anywhere in Hubbard's policies, and I can't claim to have read all of them because I haven't been exposed to all of OSA's confidential issues and that sort of thing. I've been, gathering all this stuff up in preparation for that. But in everything that I have read, and I have read a lot, I've never seen anything where Hubbard wrote, hey, let's look at all possible permutations and consequences of what we're about to engage in, and make sure that what we're doing has a cost-benefit analysis that makes sense, right? Because if they had done so, then they might have thought through, okay, what's it going to take to execute this Operation Snow White? What are the possible consequences of doing something like infiltrating the United States government at every level conceivable that we can possibly, infiltrate them at? Maybe this isn't quite, the thing we should be doing. That's kind of the point you're making here.
It is. And to that is that, I mean, analysis, the word itself, it imparts that you're looking at all sides of something. And everything that I've learned to date about Scientology, it's a very deterministic thing, and that's the last thing you want in intelligence, because the upside of chaos or randomness is also it provides opportunity. So, for instance, if these guys had thought about what may happen with Paulette or what may happen with the Guardian's office and Snow White, they may have been able to either get some other contingency in place to at least mitigate some of the damage, or have taken the whole operation in another direction that may have gotten even more return on investment that wouldn't have exposed the entire organization.
Right.
It's best, worst, and mean cases. I mean, we're always, as intelligence analysts, looking at what is going to happen. Always, you tend to be somewhat of a pessimist as an intelligence in any organization, because you'd rather be surprised with a keen analysis than surprised by a really nasty surprise you had absolutely no clue over. And again, this is all based on the fact that you have freedom of movement, freedom of thought, freedom to go out and get multiple collection points, multiple different types of assets in use. And again, instead of this deterministic path that says because L. Ron Hubbard said it's going to be this way, ergo we must go out and pursue this path, to ruin in many cases.
Yeah, exactly. And to make sure everybody's on the same page with what we're talking about, because I'm sort of assuming that people who are watching this video are thoroughly familiar with Operation Snow White, but just to be clear, this was an operation that Hubbard wrote and enacted in the early 1970s to go into government files, get them, like literally, physically go get the files that existed at the FBI, at the IRS, maybe eventually even go into the CIA or something. I mean, like really heavily secured locations, even back in the 1970s, and clean the files, as you mentioned, scrub them, right? Like get anything out of them that was negative about L. Ron Hubbard. And the first question I have, now that I've got an opportunity to ask an intelligence professional, how did Hubbard not imagine that no one was going to remember what was in those files? I mean, how would somebody imagine that by going in and taking things out of those files, that was somehow going to solve every problem connected with L. Ron Hubbard's reputation with the government? Did they imagine that no one was ever going to remember anything that was there? Or
well, it's hubris. I mean, it goes back to the nature of L. Ron Hubbard, really.
Well, it does. I just wanted to make sure I wasn't missing something, because it seems to me the whole point was flawed.
But I think, go back in the history of L. Ron Hubbard's relationship with anything involving authority, he's always, looked at it with, complete and abject scorn. I mean, the whole thing about WOGs and all that rubbish, he's not going to give him any credit. These are gray desk bureaucrats watching the clock, screw you, right?
Right.
Sorry. I mean, the reason that they got busted is somebody actually, one of those stupid gray desk bureaucrats, noticed an irregularity or an anomaly in the way that they were accessing a particular place after hours.
That's
Again,
right.
This is the caprice of human emotion. He didn't, his hubris didn't incorporate that into the calculation, and this is a thing that, when you think something through, confirmation bias is rampant. Confirmation bias says these guys are stupid. Ergo, I won't get caught. They have no backup files. All that money they spent with IBM, I'll tell you what there, Ron. Somebody ought to go to Silver Spring, Maryland and see the warehouses that the government keeps stuff in, right? So good luck saying they lost the paperwork.
Yeah, exactly.
But again, all this to me, it's emblematic of the rot in the organization when it comes to any kind of you always have to give the enemy that, George Patton said that actually not even Patton, but there's an axiom in military science that says that the enemy always has a vote in any kind of plan. So, when you hit the meeting engagement, all bets are off, because nothing will ever happen. I mean, if you look at the 91 Gulf War and the overrunning of the Iraqi army and all that, that just didn't happen on a whim. There was a hell of a lot of planning went into that, and things happen for a reason. Vince Lombardi said that there's no such luck. It's the preparation of opportunity and preparedness.
Right.
So, and what Hubbard takes out of that is preparedness, and substituting that for hubris, and we know better because we're Scientologists.
Yeah, well, the arrogance was certainly there. All right, let's shift slightly over now to a a point you made in the article that you wrote that I also wanted to take up, which is that a lot of what the church is engaged in that they might think or call or refer to as an intelligence operation is actually psychological warfare.
Yeah.
Especially against critics, right? Can you elaborate on that?
Absolutely. It's part and parcel again to my observation about, espionage being kind of the underlying, wanting to be an espionage organization rather than an intelligence organization. That is what I think was the root of Hubbard's focus here. Again, because we're looking primarily at surveillance operations that are involved in reputational ruin, stuff like going through people's garbage and all. I mean, this is, PI 101. And, and the use of cutouts, for instance, again, with, in fact, the thing that's going on right now with Paul Haggis is a textbook example of, either harassment by lawsuit or what have you. These are all things that don't necessarily benefit benefit the end goals of the church. They give everybody a warm and fuzzy because they're doing something at the tactical level, so they can tell the troops, "Hey, we're fighting all this end theta."
Yeah,
but it's low-level stuff.
Let me catch you off for just a second because I need to define what is a cutout. What does that mean for anybody who doesn't know?
A cutout is an individual that is used to create plausible deniability. So, if I am David Miscavige, I'm going to, this is these armies of PIs and lawyers that the church constantly uses to put in some kind of plausible deniability or distancing from a particular activity. So then it takes a little bit of, investigative chops to find out who's the power behind the throne, if you will.
Okay.
And it's very common in, in espionage instances. It's used. There's this idea of what's called a false flag operation. It's very similar, where somebody will do something under the guise of one particular idiom or ideology, when in fact they support something that's completely counter to the goals of that particular organization.
Okay.
And we go back to this idea, everything kind of comes off of surveillance, really, if you look at the church, looking at people's trash and then looking at the way people behave, so you can find some type of, in Scientology terms, their ruin, not so much from trying to cure it and is the way that their doctrine says, but more so to use it as a means to destroy a critic.
That's right.
So, you look at what happened with, Mike and Marty when they first came out, all this, that squirrel buster nonsense, or having cameras in your face. This is all stuff that's, psychologically guaranteed to rattle you. And it's right out of the, anybody's espionage playbook that's looking to try and destroy somebody's will to take on a particular entity or to pursue a particular political line, or in this case, to go after a particular entity, i.e. the church.
Yeah,
but
it's certainly
warfare in its first state.
Okay, it's certainly reflective of Hubbard's vindictive nature.
Absolutely.
He was writing about this as far back as the mid 1950s. How this quote, "ruin them utterly," when he's referring to critics, that comes from that time period, right? And then later, 10 years, 15 years later.
Yeah, fair gaming and all this stuff, whatever euphemism you want to use, it's just all about, taking somebody off the battlefield, right? And let's talk about what it is. I mean, if we look at, Hubbard, the more I read his stuff, he had an obsession with military science and intelligence stuff. And so many things are couched in terms of the enemy or the battle or the coming conflict or blah, blah, blah. So it's not a real leap to be talking about this stuff in terms of what a, more so a military intelligence or military dirty black bags or, nation state professional intelligence or espionage organization would undertake.
Right. Now, do you think that this is from what you've seen and, you've read about Alex Jentzsch's situation, you've become familiar with former members, what we went through, how the church operates, what the carrot is that they're offering, and how they go about, like you mentioned, it's a cash cow. There's zero question about that. Do you think that this how would you imagine OSA, or the Guardian's office now turned into OSA, would operate constructively to forward the church's activities, Church of Scientology's activities? Like, how would you see it different, how that they would actually be doing it right?
Well, let's look at the commercial world. Look at the way Johnson & Johnson handled the Tylenol scare. Okay, you take something that's inherently toxic. This med is killing people. They went out and they got it all off the shelves. They issued mea culpa PR. They went out and they proactively said, we know we screwed up. I mean, it was a brilliant, I mean, it's a, you know, Harvard textbook case of the right thing to do in corporate branding and corporate marketing terms. And if you look at the church right now, I mean, its brand is toxic. JP refers to it as, kitty corn, or Ebola covered kitty corn or something like that, right? I mean, it's just heinous stuff.
Yeah.
And I mean, you have to, the first thing I would say is, get rid of the shovel, because a good thing is to stop digging, right? And that imparts some semblance of organizational unity. The problem is that you've got a tyrant at the top that's just I mean, this is, it's a nepotistic. God, you could just run with the adverbs and adjectives with it, but nothing's going to happen until Miscavige realizes that he is the thing that's making this thing as toxic as possible. Because at the end of the day, the folks down here are probably saying, I believe in what I'm doing, and if OSA had a mandate to help rally those people for the common good rather than spoofing them about what's actually going on. I mean, honesty is the best policy. And even in professional intelligence organizations, the troops know, provided they have the need to know, what's going on and what the goals are. You ask somebody at the CIA, they're going to say it's to further the geopolitical processes and status of the United States as a global power. Simple. If you go and you ask somebody in OSA, oh yeah, we want to keep Scientology working. But if you ask somebody that's in an org that has maybe 6 people coming in there, like you were talking about the other day, he's looking at his stats, right? But is there any kind of correlation to those stats to the malice and spite and all the other stuff that's going on with OSA? No.
Right.
So, you have to have organizational coherence to have any kind of good come out of it. And so, to your point, I would say that Scientology needs to take a hard look at itself and say, what's the message we want to impart? If we are the best hope for mankind in solving crime, war, and all this other stuff, well, why aren't our volunteer ministers going up to places that are really, really nasty places to be and doing something of benefit? Or why isn't all this money that's being poured into empty orgs going into buying pallets of food for hurricane refuge? I mean, it's such common sense, it boggles the mind they don't get it. So, I mean, this is the kind of stuff you do to prevent reputational ruin. Does it have anything to do with intelligence? Well, yes, it does, in the sense that, part of PSYOPs, psychological operations, is positive propaganda. It's putting a message out there that draws people to the cause. And that involves and Hubbard talked about this, influence agents, the whole idea, why do you think there's a celebrity center? The problem is that the brand is structured in such a way that it's toxic to even anybody that's supposedly going to go out and advocate it. So until that toxicity is purged, you're at square one.
Big time. Big time. I could not agree with you more. And it does come from the top. Zero question about it.
In fact, something just occurred to me. If you look at, at the end of the Vietnam War, the CIA actually was very phenomenally successful during the war. But in what context? In the terms of defeat, of advocating American interests, or in terms of the box of espionage? Well, maybe a little bit of both, some not some more. But there was a very famous hearings led by Frank Church that came out and basically excoriated the CIA for their behavior. He was showing all kinds of tools of the trade and all this stuff. And it was it was a nadir probably for the agency during the Cold War. And they sat back and figured out, how do we, get, our reputation restored with our customers, which is, people in, the politicians and government that need to make decisions off our stuff, and the American people, because at the end of the day, it's their tax dollars, right? And they went through a very methodical program of outreach to say, this is what we're doing, where there's some mea culpas on, working with the FBI on campus unrest. Maybe we went over the board here, this, that, and the other thing. And the one thing they did is they released boatloads of unclassified and declassified information so people could see what actually had been going on. Think about how hard, Chris, it is to get information out of the Church of Scientology.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, that would be one major thing, is just to open the doors and say, hey, this is our stuff. Not so much, the OT8 and all the, the WikiLeaks stuff, but just the day-to-day way that the thing runs, so that people can understand that, again, when you look at it, it's this monolithic, malevolent thing, just like people perceived the CIA back in the day. And yet here we are, people are, probably still may not trust it, this, that, or the other thing, but still I would say that there's a higher degree of confidence in the capabilities and competence of the CIA than there will ever be in the Church of Scientology. Right. So, it's actually not quite an apples to orange comparison if you really look at it.
Okay, fair enough. Now, if we remove the Snow White disaster, I mean, everybody can have their Watergate. Let's say, for example, okay, they have their the pie in the face, 11 people go to jail, right. Things screwed up, throws Mary Sue under the bus, like that all happens, right? But since then, have you seen any sign or indication that there has been anything that they learned from that, or that they are now operating in a more professional manner, having learned from their mistakes?
The thing that I'm constantly amazed by the church is that its inability to learn from its mistakes. There is no institutional memory in the church that allows them to be introspective and figure out how we can do something better, at least from what I can see. I mean, you may, or other people out there may disagree with that, having been in the church, but I'm a student of organizations, and when I look at the Church of Scientology, I just see this sclerotic thing that doesn't have the ability to be self-referential or introspective in a positive vein. It's always externalizing its problems, and when you don't take or own, responsibility for something or own it, you're never going to fix it. So, if I were to look at the arc of operations, quote unquote, since say post Mary Sue in the say the DM era, I see a highly competent surveillance operation, yet its competence is based on probably its repetitive ability. You always get good at something the more you do it, right? But how much of that is outsourced? See, this is the other thing too. It's one thing to say you have internal competence. It's another to say you have competence just because you hire people that are good at it. But, if you look at the amount of blowback the church has had over time, it just doesn't know how to keep the lid on stuff, number one. Number two, it doesn't understand that the people that it's doing all this to, in the greater picture to the rest of the world, it looks petty, vindictive, and nonsensical, right? Last time I'm a Roman Catholic, and I last time I looked, I haven't seen, a padre out in my bushes trying to see what I'm doing with myself, right?
Right.
I mean, it's so antithetical to the whole idea of a church. And so I think this is what's so ludicrous. It's one thing to keep tabs on your membership through mailing lists or, tithing or what I would say are normally our religious norms of control, if you will. But the church takes that one step further and says, well, we want to control everybody that's ever come in contact with us or doesn't like us. I mean, it's the gamut is just beyond the pale, really.
It is. And it speaks actually to Hubbard's, it actually goes back to a very basic fundamental of the Scientology philosophy or worldview, right? Which is that Scientologists consider themselves the phrase is at cause. Mm-hmm. They are the ones in the driver's seat. They are the ones who make things happen. They are the ones who postulate, think good thoughts, put positive energy out there. They don't put it in those terms, but that is what they're talking about. But basically they're the ones who think that they are the causative agents of their own lives and therefore of the world at large. And that pervades every aspect of their organization.
So if you think of that thought vacuum, if you will, we're talking about this worldview that's stuck in a 1950s mindset, and more so by policy is stuck. I mean, they've got a stake in the ground where that comes from.
Yeah.
And and looking at the documents that Hubbard has put out on quote unquote intelligence, I'm thinking of the intelligence principles and the checklist we discussed. It has those reference tomes on it. Nowhere in there does it show any room for adaptability over time.
That's right.
I mean, espionage is probably the most innovative field in warfare, if you think about it, outside of technical. Certainly the technical component of it, but just the way that we look at people. Look at crowdsourcing. I mean, the age of the internet. I mean, they've done nothing to change their means of intelligence propagation, if you will, in the age of utter and total scrutiny. And this is what has really exposed them, to people like myself and others, to the folly of what they're trying to do. If nothing, turn it around, use that as a means to counter the N theta. but don't sit there and put up a smear site with pictures that look like they were hijacked out of the National Enquirer. Come out with a reasoned argument about why somebody's wrong. I mean, it's simple.
It's so funny. It's so funny you bring this up, because when I was in the church, later years of my time there, I didn't realize at this time when I'm telling you about this that I was going to be leaving soon, but I was almost in despair at the church's misuse of the internet. And I was a Sea Org member at the time, right? So I had a very limited use of the internet or exposure to the internet, very self-policing as to what I would look at. But my point of despair was not XENU is on the internet, or, there's N Theta, bad news on the internet. My problem was I go to all these events, I hear all this good news, all this wonderful expansion of Scientology, and I can't find one corollary or corroboration of any of it anywhere on the internet.
It's all counterfactual to your experience, right?
That's right. And I couldn't find, and what I was most frustrated about was I was thinking, well, if there was anything we as a church could be doing right now, it would be flooding the internet with success stories and wins and gains from Scientologists. And you find some of that out there, and you come to realize as a former member, and it was only as a former member I realized this, that there are so few of those success stories and wins and gains to put out there, that what you see on the internet is a correct proportion of criticism to successes. It's not that the church isn't putting those successes out there, it's that there are so few to put out there. But we were being fed this whole line about millions of members, hundreds of thousands of successes, millions of people's lives touched by Narconon and applied scholastics and all this. But they're just inflating those. It's just all exaggerated nonsense,
Well, and to that, the stuff that they do put out as successes are really banal in the grand scheme of things.
Yeah.
When looking relative to an organization that theoretically is $1.5 billion in assets or cash, that should be doing a whole heck of a lot more with this. And I think what you raise a good point about the net is that, if anything, it's keeping intelligence organizations honest in the way that they go out and collect product. It's keeping government entities a little bit more to the public fore so that we know what's going on. I mean, I've always felt it's, I'm kind of the exception to the rule. Well, actually, there's a lot of folks in my era that feel we classify entirely too much stuff. Because at the end of the day, freedom is the best disinfectant and gives you probably the cleanest read, if you will, on the status quo, which is what we're trying to prognosticate against, really, at the end of the day, right? And this is where the church just doesn't get it, is that the more opaque you are, the more people are going to take the opposite view of you being successful or a great thing. They're going to sit there and think, man, something's really going on there that I don't want a bit of. I don't want a piece of that. I mean, could you imagine the recruiting capability that the church could leverage if they had cleaned up their act 10, 15 years ago, and it come out and say, hey, we realize this connection is something that we need to review, but until they get over this entrenched idea of source, it's never going to happen. They are going to be stuck trying to adapt the unadaptable while they're trying to pitch the unacceptable, really.
That's right.
That's wants to hear this stuff.
And they really, I think that's a very good point about the internet and the speed with which information flies around now. I mean, it happens in minutes. I mean, seconds even. There can be a meeting in the White House, and within minutes of that meeting concluding, we hear about what happened in the meeting, right? And it is disseminated around the world in microseconds.
And so here's, to that, there's an idea in warfare now called asymmetric warfare. Typical warfare is a very linear thing. You have opposing battles, and maybe you might do an end around with an armor attack or something. That's where Scientology is stuck in the linear battle. Right now, its critics, we're running asymmetric warfare on the church. And they're trying to counter with bits of asymmetric warfare in the sense of maybe an internet story here, maybe a countersuit here. But, one or two stabs in the dark does not make a strategy. And this is the whole point I was trying to make in my piece on JP's site, was that the church they just have no concept of strategy. They don't think strategically. They don't do anything that imparts any kind of worldview that goes beyond the next 5 minutes or the next whale. It's all about, where are we going to get cash, rather than what's our perception out in the real world going to be in a week, a month, a year. That involves strategy. That involves looking at taking opposing viewpoints and giving them credence, accepting them, not necessarily validating them until you can. But that never happens in Scientology, because anybody that's counter to you is obviously down stat, not worth listening to. So the whole exercise is doomed from the inception, Chris.
Big time, big time. I have a question. Are there other organizations, are there churches specifically that you have ever seen that have anything like this? I have been told, when I brought this up and I said, well, you don't see this sort of thing going on with, the Catholic Church or the Vatican or something. And I had people go, oh, really? And I went, oh, okay, well, maybe I don't know so much about that. So
let's look at it there's probably two frames of reference here. There's new religious movements, and then there's what I would call established religions. The Catholic Church, being what it is, has always had an intelligence side to it, going back to the Borgias. If not, the church was as much it's a nation state. It has
literally,
it's a country. The Vatican is a country. So, there has always been a geopolitical component to any religion of size, be it the Russian Orthodox Church, be it Judaism and its relationship with Israel. Certainly, there is stuff going on behind the scenes to manipulate either the message or the political scene in a particular place of interest, or the way money moves. I mean, look at, BCCI, the Bank of Credit Commerce International scandal. A huge component of its dirty money came from the Vatican Bank, right? So, these cardinals sit around, and there's other stuff that they're doing besides glorifying God. And I'm not saying that's a rank indictment of everybody in the Catholic Church, but it's any, monolithic organization is going to have problems with security, with veracity, and ethics. Really, it's an ethical thing at the end of the day, isn't it? Yeah. So, and again, you look at the way the Haganah was. It's a terrorist organization within Jewish that wanted to overthrow the Brits, but its tenets were found in Judaism. It was part and parcel to the religious government of the time. So it all depends. It's one man's freedom fighters, another man's terrorists, and you just look at it in the same guise of religion. You fast forward to new religious movements. And if we put the Mormons in there, or the JWs or something, any organization that size is going to have somebody or a group of people in it tasked to see what people are thinking about it, and not necessarily in a marketing perspective.
Right.
I would submit it goes probably a little farther than that, into probably the realm of intelligence gathering, in the sense that they're going out and fact finding and reviewing their position on the web. Certainly the Mormons do this. They have the money to do it, number one. It's a function of cash flow. The evangelical Christians, my gosh, there's a lot of former military that are evangelical Christians. What says that they're not, combining with the Southern Baptist Convention to look at ways of shaping the political conversation in this country? And we know they do that. Now, is lobbying a form of intelligence gathering? Yeah, because you're shaping the message. It's the politicizing of intelligence, if you will. And, if you look back at World War II, the British were very good at this. There were a variety of MIs. There was MI6, MI9. They all had a certain job. And there was a political component that did nothing but figure out ways to make fun of the Nazis, printing pornographic photos of Hitler on postage stamps. Just really ludicrous stuff, but guaranteed to let the Germans know that, we're making fun of this guy. So, satire can be just as effective a weapon as, firing rounds down range. It's the same thing. And so I would say, yes, I would say that there are churches out there doing this. To the extent of Scientology, no, because I don't think that they had this determinist remit from their founder to go out and be spooks.
Exactly.
I think that's where the church is the Church of Scientology is so unique in so many different things. Unfortunately, most of them rather malevolent. But this is certainly one thing they're superbly unique in, if there's such a thing.
Yeah, it's very true. Because I don't think the Council of Elders of the JWs particularly have some extension arm that is some world-class data collection.
Yes,
And
Brother Jones will talk today on our latest electronic warfare gathering capabilities.
Exactly, exactly. My friend Lloyd Evans describes the ruling council as the survival of the dumbest. So that's they're not really that on top of those things. But I do believe what you said about the Mormons for sure.
Yeah, and again, I don't want to cast aspersions on anybody's faith. I think what you have to look at, though,
no. This is an organizational matter, not a faith matter.
Yeah.
We're not bragging on anybody's beliefs right now.
What's going on under the hood or over the horizon? It comes back to human behavior, and that's where I'll leave it at that.
Fair enough. Yeah, no. There's no hit on anybody's faith. Not my point at all. Okay, now let's talk about Marty Rathbun, because we discussed this briefly. Marty was a former church staff member, a high-level member, actually literally second in charge under David Miscavige for a period of time. Defected from the church in the mid-2000s, laid low for a while, came out, started doing independent Scientology practice. The church then came after him. This is where you get the squirrel busters. They, camp out at his house for 6 months. Very right? And then he gets married to a woman who's never been a Scientologist. Then she files a court civil suit against the Church of Scientology for harassment and stalking and following them around and that sort of thing. Because while the church was maintaining that their First Amendment rights and the church policy state that they go after former members, and Marty Rathbun should understand that this was a natural consequence of being a Scientologist, she was never part of that. And so she was like, yeah, I don't think so. And that was the basis of their court case. This court case went on for a couple of years. It was being litigated in Texas. It was moving forward great guns, and it looked like there were very positive steps being made with even getting David Miscavige, the head of Scientology, deposed, or he was going to be deposed. It was going to be in writing, not in the courtroom, but it was still going to be more advance had been made in the direction of connecting David Miscavige's direct causal abuses to Scientology than anything else that had ever happened before. And then suddenly the court case is dropped. Marty Rathbun pulls out, Monique pulls out, the case is no longer happening, the lawyer is fired, and then suddenly, out of nowhere, I guess about a year or so ago, I don't have all the timeline laid out by day, but Marty Rathbun then starts putting out videos that look very professional and sleekly produced and look extremely like Church of Scientology produced videos, because there is a style and way that they make their videos. And he is castigating and casting aspersions on everyone and everything he has ever been connected to. Leah's show, Mike Rinder, Tony Ortega, like everyone. He even wrote a blog post against me. I mean, which was like, what?
Well, it's a classic deniability op.
Right. So that was what I'm going to ask you about, is what do you perceive this entire course of events to look like from a professional intelligence espionage point of view?
So I liken it, let's look at it in Cold War terms.
Okay.
Marty was a long-time concierge case officer of the KGB, for instance. Let's just say he's the opposition. This is a guy that knows where all the skeletons are buried. He's a true believer, an autodidact, sharp guy. I've read all this stuff. I've read Memories of a Scientology Warrior, his books on Reformation. Certainly been out to Moving On a little higher. So I have I think a pretty good understanding of Marty's worldview. To that, we go back. I go right back to my premise and my thesis. The base of my thesis here on human behavior is that we are subject to both internal and external motivations when we are deeply ensconced in something that is so doctrinal or so rapaciously controlled. It's within our nature to rebel at times, or at times to have our eyes open to the evil that we're promulgating by our very existence in this organization. I think Marty had a catharsis at some point that drove him to come out and say enough. The whole Tampa Bay Times or St. Peter's Times article series and that whole kind of a confessional thing. I think I think he tried to get rid of a lot of demons that brought him to at least some semblance of stasis and comfort with himself. His rapprochement with Mike and some of these other people that came out and saying, boy, I'm glad to be out of that. And let me just take a big breather. And what now? What can I do with this, though? Okay, here's a guy that spent all his time in the church. I mean, how do you go out and sell yourself? I was a professional Scientologist. Well, I don't think there's not a lot of call in the market for that. He's tried to write some books and do some other stuff. I'm a great believer in reinvention. We all do it. I think problem is Marty never effectively purged himself of the cult mindfuck of the way that you have this stuff drilled into your brain. It's like going back to heroin, the sweet siren song of the first hit, right? So fast forward, he gets involved with his court case. He's got a lovely woman by his side. He wants to, he's a very manly guy. He wants to do the right thing. He wants to protect his woman. He's got a real bone for David Miscavige. Here's a legal, proper, and appropriate vehicle to perhaps get this thing put to bed. And I think somewhere along the line, he was either approached with, an incredible amount of money, or there is a combination of carrot and stick going on. Either he's got, and this would certainly play to their playbook as far as being compromised. There's either something in his preclear, something is still floating around in the church that has him, on a real short lease. But hey, we'll give you a little cash to make it look like it's, something that you're not make it look like, because we're trying to keep us all in the QT, but make it look like to Marty that the church is being gracious. I don't see any other reason for him to stop cold. I mean, I followed that thing. I've talked to Jeff. He was in the courtrum. I've talked to a lot of people. I mean, this was just so out of the blue.
That's right.
But there has to be something, a pivot, just an event of monumental proportions. And the only way I can see that is he was, somebody came up to him, probably Miscavige, and said, I will give you something that you want to either be a cutout or to work for me in some way that you can put all this stuff behind you and kind of get the rest of the folks back on the reservation, as it were. And that starts with, this big mea culpa, I was wrong, reeling back all these things that you mentioned, his books, his behavior, blah, blah, blah. And certainly, given, I don't know where his run rate is outside of getting money for the church to make these videos, that imparts some kind of collaboration with someone.
That's right.
That has some kind of material means to do this. And I liken it to the way, Guy Burgess or Kim Philby bailed on the British establishment when they defected to Moscow. Some people come back from the other side, very rare. But when they do, they're usually a double agent. They're usually doing something that is going to benefit. They're always playing both sides against the middle, really, at the end of the day, Chris.
Yeah.
So I look at this as being a fairly sophisticated operation on Marty's and the church's part to kind of put, the maximum apostate back in his cage somehow, as a object lesson to other people that are thinking about doing the same. Because, when I'm out on the blogs and talking to people, the big thing that people want is a RICO prosecution of the church. And when you look at this, there's endemic racketeering in the church, which is one clause. But to get a prosecution on something like this, you need somebody to roll. You need a whistleblower. You need somebody on the inside. And I think this is one of the few instances that Miscavige and company may be playing the long game and saying, listen, all you people out there that are thinking about maybe, doing something with the feds or this is the kind of crap you're going to go through. Look at Rathbun. Yeah, you might get some money, you might get a little freedom, but you really want to do it at the end of the day? And I don't think anybody's going to get a deal like Amy Scobie or anybody else, or who wrote the letter? I'm sorry.
Oh, not Amy Scobie. Yeah. Debbie Cook.
I don't think the days of a Debbie Cook payoff, if you will, and my apologies, Debbie, for forgetting your name, that's done. I think Miscavige is he's through. He's going to be playing hardball with anybody that comes out, because the stakes are so high now. There's so much on the church now that they know that if the feds get involved in this thing, this whole cards is coming down.
Well, for sure. And I'm hearing that, whereas before, like in the day, back even to 2012, when somebody like me comes out, here's your $500, pat on the head, off you go. And here's, an inch of documents to sign on video saying you'll never say anything about us. yet that has no teeth because $500 is nothing. But
Well, yeah, all
now
those
I'm
contracts are
hearing,
completely unenforceable anyway.
well, yeah. So now I'm hearing that they are signing NDAs when people are leaving, say, Golden Era Productions or Int Management, up at Hemet, where they're getting real money,
Interesting.
to enforce the silence, like where they're signing NDAs that have actual teeth, and they're getting a substantial payment so that there is zero chance that they are ever going to speak out. Now that's what I'm hearing. I can't corroborate, I can't say for sure that that's what's happening, but you'll notice that there's not a whole lot of new defectors who are speaking out, and yet there are new defectors. There are people
Well,
leaving.
basically, just because they're getting money and signing NDAs doesn't necessarily mean that they don't have a case for doing that under duress. So I think you also have to look at what's the context of those signings. And I would submit that those payments are being very selectively given. I think there's a strategy involved in that as well.
Yeah.
I think that DM has probably hired some HR folk in here. He's not going to trust Scientologists to figure this out. He's going to outsource his exit strategy to people that are going to be able to probably button it up pretty tight. But again, at the end of the day, that's still, there's immunity deals. The feds have a lot of ways to pierce we always hear the corporate veil.
Mm-hmm.
So I wouldn't say that that's going to torpedo any efforts. Because I think, we have to look at the collective of all that's gone on, with tax exemption being under scrutiny, just, more examples of like the Mason King abuse stuff coming out. This is where the blog sphere and people like Tony and Mike and all of this collective exposure, certainly Leia, are getting the laymen out there that couldn't have even given a rip about Scientology 5 years ago, all of a sudden saying, what the hey is going on here?
That's right.
So this is going back to your observation about what the church should be doing. There's a Damoclean sword right now with Scientology media productions and them wanting to get a better view of the world, right?
Yeah.
And unless they figure out a way to retweak this message big time, they are doomed to failure at some point. Now, yeah, they got this great run rate, and there's a lot of different permutations on what the end state is going to be, no people or DM flees to the Bahamas, who knows? They got a lot of money and that buys you a lot of time. But that doesn't buy you a means of completely altering the message in such a way that it can, I think, make any sea change in the perception of the average person out there about the church, just because they are so rooted in the past, Chris.
That's right.
And I think, and that's what I believe in, and that's what motivates me in finding the money and completely and always exposing this behavior as you do, as anybody else does, so that enough people get out there. There's enough this collective outrage gets to a point where we do something either at the federal or state level. And it's getting there, but this is a long game. People have to remember, and that's the way it is in intelligence. The capers that really do the big thing in intelligence are the ones that take forever. I shouldn't say forever, take a long time and are always under the hood. They come out later. Like when the Glomar Explorer went out there and pulled up a piece of a Soviet submarine outside of the Marianas Trench, or digging a communications tunnel that taps the Soviet communications in the east. This is all marvelous stuff, but it takes time, it takes some smarts, and more importantly, it takes the ability to adapt when you're doing it if you hit a roadblock. And again, that's something that Scientology does not do, and to me, that just completely takes any pretense of sophistication or competence and intelligence right off the table.
Big time. I agree with you completely. Every time over the last 5 years that I've been concerned about some new thing coming out from the church, some new program, some new strategy or something that they announce at their events, I've always been like, ooh, is this gonna do something different? Are they really changing? And every time, nope. They have not changed a thing.
I said something today, I think it was on Tony's blog. It's Einstein's definition of insanity, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Keep doing the same crap until it change. Well, it ain't. It ain't gonna until somebody has the nous to sit there and say enough with L. Ron Hubbard. Let's do the right thing. And I just don't see that happening.
No, not with Scientology. They no, they can't change. They won't change, and they're and if they were going to reinvent themselves or remarket themselves in such a way that they would actually not be toxic anymore and not be so horrible, you wouldn't even recognize it as Scientology anymore.
No, no.
It would be so different. So anyway, I don't think we have a lot to fear on that front. All right, Jeff. Well, listen, we've covered these points well, at least what I wanted to cover for now. I really appreciate your time on this. I think I think you bring a valuable voice to our cause here, and some valuable intelligence to
I would like to think so.
Yeah, to what we're doing.
I would like to say one thing. I'd like to encourage folks. You can either reach me at cosmoneydoc, that's COSMONEYDOC@gmail.com, or out at jpcapitalist.com, or at the Scientology Money Project. Those are the three places I hang my hat. If you have any input on money in the church, any input on what we said today, if it's I'm full of beans or great things, or there's other things I should be thinking about, please fire it my way, or you can certainly send it to Chris and it'll get to me. This is a group effort. We're all collection assets. We're all out there trying to find the right thing, the right piece of information that in combination with other pieces of information are going to bring these guys down. So, and this is a thing, the proper intelligence picture is always made of really little, seemingly disparate things. It's the linking together of those into the bigger picture that brings things down. So please, if there's stuff out there you think, fire it to me, fire it to Chris, fire it to Jeff Augustine, and let's see what we can do about this thing, this entity, as it were. Perfect.
And yes, please
Have a lovely day, Chris. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you for being on here. Please, folks, do leave your comments, good, bad, or sideways, in the comments section below here on YouTube. I will definitely be directing Jeff to look at those comments as well. And thanks very much for coming around. And we are going to end off now, and we'll see you guys next time. Bye-bye.